Hey everybody, it's Innovision, and we're back with the most epic storage mod of the century for your ROG Ally Z1 and Z1 Extreme console. Now with this mod, you'll be able to install a 2TB, 4TB, or up to 8TB internal NVMe SSD. This is a fully internal storage solution. Beautiful. Now with this mod, you'll be able to install a full-size 2280 NVMe SSD, and it's all made possible by using this 2230 to 2280 adapter made by Syntec. Now there are other adapters out there, but the reason I chose to go with this one is I've actually used Syntec adapters in the past on other projects and had a good experience with them. So you may ask yourself, why go through the trouble of installing a 2280 NVMe? And there are several reasons. First and foremost, PC games are huge. They're big. They take up a lot of space. I installed like 4 games on my Ally and I already ran out of space. And by using a full-size 2280 drive, we can get a better cost per gigabyte. Not only that, when we use a 2280 drive, we can find a drive that has better performance characteristics than the stock drive that shipped with the device. And in some cases, if you're careful about the parameters, you can actually get a drive that has slightly better thermal characteristics than the drive that shipped with the device. With the extra storage, you can dual boot your Ally with Windows and BASI OS, which is a SteamOS-like operating system. You can have that Windows access to all PC games, but if you want the more casual gaming experience and SteamOS-like experience, you get almost like a Steam Deck for free. And on top of all that, there are a lot more storage solutions out there for the 2280 form factor. There's only a handful of drives that fit the 2230 form factor that we have available to us. When you go up to the 2280 size drive, there's so many solutions out there that you can pick from. And the best part of all, this is an internal mod. So there's not going to be any cords or dongles hanging off your device. Everything's internal to the console. There were SD memory card issues early on with the Ally, and you can completely sidestep that issue by picking a big enough storage drive. So here's the list of materials you need for the mod of the century. You'll need a ROG Ally. Now this is not the Ally X. This is the Ally that's either the Z1 or Z1 Extreme. You'll need a full-size 2280 NVMe SSD. Take care that it's a single-sided SSD, and you want to make sure that it's 2.5 amps and 3.3 volts. Ideally, less than 2.5 amps is better, because that means this drive will just sip power relative to the spec that the NVMe slot has in this device. You'll need the 2230 to 2280 adapter. This is the Syntec adapter. You'll need electrical tape, a pry tool, and a Phillips head screwdriver for small electronics. Now I'll provide links for all of these items in the description of the video. Now before we get started with the mod of the century, this is our disclaimer. We're not responsible for any damage you may cause to your Ally. We're not responsible for any injuries or accidents, and we're not responsible for any voiding of your warranty, should you choose to do the mod of the century. Now, to be completely honest, it's not a difficult mod, and the benefits totally outweigh the risks. I don't have to worry about running out of storage space. I can dual boot my system. I have many other options out there, and I can completely sidestep using the SD memory card slot. Alright, we're all set up here, so let's get started. First thing we're going to want to do is grab a fairly large anti-static cloth, or maybe even a towel, something soft. I'm going to lay it down here, and then the next thing I'm going to do is grab a shirt that I've folded just right. So I don't have a case for this ROG Ally. If you have a case, the best thing to do would be to put it in the case. I'm going to put this face down on a t-shirt that has an anti-static cloth underneath it. That's going to be useful too to help stop the screws from rolling around as we take it apart, but you could also use like a small medicine cup. And so we're going to go through and remove 6 screws off the back plate. With the 6 screws loosened up, I'm taking a magnetized screwdriver to lift the screws out of their slots. Now this bottom screw here, you're going to want to save for the very end, because it's going to be useful for, once you start to loosen it up, it starts to separate the case right here, which gives you plenty of clearance to insert your pry tool. Let me just make sure it's loosened all the way before we get started. It appears so. And I had the same thing happen on my Ally X. It wouldn't come out the first time, but I'm not worried about it. So now we're going to take the pry tool and insert it in the gap that was formed and just start gently twisting all around the perimeter of the case until the case pops off. Once you've got the case separated all the way around, you should be able to just pop it off from the top here. There we go. Now we're going to do the same thing to this side. And as you do this, also take care that you're not going to push the power button by accident. Alright, now that we've got the case separated, the SSD is located under here, but before we get started, we should disconnect the battery from the motherboard so we don't cause any power to still be available. So we just disconnected the battery, and now we can get started. The SSD should be located right under this anti-static piece of material. So we're going to set this aside safely. We're going to try to reinstall it afterwards. And so here's our SSD. Using a small electronics Phillips head screwdriver, we're going to remove the screw that's securing the SSD into place. Now we should be able just to lift the SSD. Lift it ever so slightly, but pulling it out, but don't lift too much. Alright, and so here's our SSD. Okay, so it says that it's 3.3 volts by 2.5 amps. And so what that means we don't want to use an SSD that exceeds 8.25 watts. So ideally, honestly, I'm going to stick with an SSD that's about 5 watts anyways, because this wasn't originally intended to have a 2280 full-size NVMe SSD, and so I'd be worried about heat dissipation. So, you know, in other projects, I've used lower voltage SSDs that still provide similar performance to the one that was provided with the console. But before we install our 2280 SSD, we're going to install our Syntec adapter, and I'm going to reinstall the stock SSD and run some benchmarks just to show that the adapter is not causing any unnecessary latency. Nice, so here's our adapter, and so it's going to install just like this, and it looks like it's going to rest right on the battery cable, but that's okay. So that's another reason why we're going to want to make sure we don't generate too much heat in here. So the way I finally got it to go in, I had to come in at an angle like this, but very gently, and I'm going to push it down. It's going to produce a small amount of friction across the battery foil. Just hold it so it's not, you know, pushing and scraping the battery foil off, and just get it to slide down in there. So we got it in there. And so the next thing we're going to want to do is secure the adapter using the SSD's screw. Alright, looks like we're secured. Feels solid. Before installing our 2280 NVMe SSD into the adapter, we want to take a moment to go over an optional step here. The optional step is to remove a small plastic peg on the back part of the case to allow room internally for the NVMe SSD to have a low profile heatsink. The reason we suggest this optional step is that once the 2280 drive is installed in the adapter, it will partially sit right over the integrated CPU and GPU's dual fin heatsink. This matters because we do not want to disturb the device's thermals, nor do we want heat from the CPU and GPU compromising the integrity of our SSD. The reason we treat this as an optional step is that it is possible to find a 2280 SSD that already has a heat dissipation strip installed, and this can be effective for smaller capacity drives like 2TB drives. But for larger capacity drives like 4 or 8 terabytes, you will most certainly need a low profile heatsink. For this optional step, you'll need a small wire cutter to remove this plastic peg, and this is what it looks like once the peg has been successfully removed. My crucial drive right here, and I'm about to install this heat strip. I find the easiest thing to do is remove one of the pieces of plastic, and we're just going to lay it right over the memory banks. Once you're happy with it, then you can remove the second piece of plastic. Try to keep it as straight as possible. See how that looks? Pretty close to being straight. That looks solid. Alright, so with that, I'm just inspecting here. We see all the memory banks are covered. And so now we're going to remove that final piece of plastic and install our copper heatsink. Alright, so that's removed, and we've got our copper heatsink right here. So what we're going to do is make sure that it lines up with the rear part of the NVMe so that the screw hole is still exposed. So all the memory banks are covered, so we're just going to gently press down, but not too hard. Just gently press down so that it attaches. And so I think we're good. And so once you're done, it looks like this. Okay. So now we're going to carry on with installing it into the adapter. Alright, so before we mount the SSD, we're going to have to remove the screw that came with the Syntec adapter. And then now we're going to take our now covered with a heatsink NVMe SSD and just come in at a slight angle here, pushing it into the adapter. And you should push it until you hear that snap. And make sure in the back of the NVMe is aligned with that mounting screw slot. And so now we're going to screw it in. Alright, so that's good. Alright, now we've got our SSD mounted. We're going to go ahead and reinstall this anti-static piece of plastic that went over the NVMe originally. Now that this anti-static wrap has been reinstalled, we can go ahead and plug the battery back in. Right, the battery's plugged back in, and now we're going to attach the case back on. And so I like to start at the top here, just snapping it into place. Make sure that this, because if you start from the bottom, it's hard to get the top to match back up sometimes. All right, so both parts snapped at the top, and now we're just going to go around the perimeter of the case, snapping it until we don't hear any more snapping sounds. And that should be it. And now we're going to reinstall the screws that came with the console. Alright, so the screws are installed, feels solid. Right. Now I see you've been eyeing my toy of the day. And what we have here is the Notorious B.I.G by Super 7. This is one of the deluxe action figures they make. Now this Biggie Smalls action figure is a very nice tribute to Biggie Smalls. I have a lot of respect for him. I think his music's great, and I have a lot of respect for his family. Now you know this wouldn't be our toy of the day video if we weren't about to have some fun with this. Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis. This Biggie Smalls toy will make a nice gift. Big OLED screen, PlayStation controller. I never thought I'd have all this stuff when I got older. Alright, so now I'm going to move some of these materials and get us set up so we can start reinstalling Windows. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is just go through and verify that the drive is detected correctly and that we see it in the BIOS. Since we removed the battery pack as part of the installation, one of the things we're going to have to do to get the device to turn on is to plug it up to the power source that came with it. So this is just using your power brick that came with the console. And so now that it's all hooked up, we're going to hold down the volume down button and push the power button at the same time. Now tap on the volume down button. Alright, so we're in the BIOS and we see our 4 terabyte NVMe SSD. Look at that. From the BIOS menu like this, we're going to be able to launch the ASUS Cloud Recovery. So you can hit the Y button. That takes us, and then we're going to want to go to the Advanced tab. And you see the option there for ASUS Cloud Recovery. We're just going to go ahead and tap A on that. Alright, you just have to verify that you're at least 20 years of age. And so now we're launching the Cloud Recovery tool. So we'll have to type in our Wi-Fi password. Once you've typed your Wi-Fi password, go ahead and enter, and it's saying the connection was successful. So we're launching the Cloud Recovery tool. Now that the Cloud Recovery is running, it's going to download all the files we need for Windows to be reinstalled. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button to keep up with all the tips, tricks, and mods. Alright, so the Cloud Recovery finished downloading its files. We're going to click continue. So there's a Cloud Recovery update. Alright, so Cloud Recovery finished updating. Alright, no more updates. Alright, so now it's asking if we want to back up our files. And the answer is no, because this is a brand new hard drive. Are you sure you don't want to back up anything? Yep. Alright, so now it's going to download more files. But from this point forward, the rest of the process is fully automated. And once it's completed, once it's done downloading all its files, it's going to reboot several times and you're going to see several things pop up on the screen, but you don't have to interact with it. Once it's completed with everything, the device is going to look just like it was the day you got it, like factory condition. And that's where you would log into your Microsoft account or whatever accounts you want to log into, and then you can start setting up your device like it's a brand new device. So we're just going to let this run and we'll be back. Alright, so the Cloud Recovery finished downloading all the files. And so from this point onward, it is a fully automated process. You'll see the console reboot several times, but once it's completed and everything's done, you're going to be greeted with the Windows like computer setup screen. And so the device will be back in the exact state it was when you bought it. So it'll be restored to factory conditions, except for this time, you're going to have either a 4 or 8 terabyte hard drive installed. Alright, so after everything's done, you'll be greeted with this setup screen just like as if you bought the device brand new. Depending on your internet connection, The whole process from start to finish takes about an hour. Wow, look at that! After upgrading our Ally to 4 terabytes of storage and reinstalling Windows, we have plenty of space to spare. Here we have some results of tracking our SSD temperatures while running Crystal Disk Mark, an SSD benchmarking utility. The tool will go through several read and write benchmarks and display the best result we got over 5 iterations of each benchmark. Here we're comparing the thermal characteristics and performance of the stock SSD to the stock SSD after we install it in the adapter. This is useful to get an idea if there are any thermal or performance regressions introduced by using the adapter. The top portion of each figure is the drive temperatures being monitored using hardware info, where the screenshot is taken immediately after the benchmark completed. From left to right, the first column is the current temperature, then the minimum temperature, then the maximum temperature, and finally the average temperature. The 2 rows are showing measurements taken from the SSD's NAND hotspot temperature. Also take note that on the stock drive we only have 2 temperature sensors, both of which report the SSD NAND temperature. To summarize the illustration here, we can see there's no performance regression introduced by using the adapter. However, we can see a small performance regression in terms of thermals. As we see, the stock drive ran about 5 degrees hotter, and this is due to the drive being pushed out right over the CPU and GPU's heatsink. But overall, this is not the end of the world. Now let's take a quick look at 4 different configurations we used while testing our 4 terabyte NVMe SSD mod. Again, this was in our Ally running Crystal Disk Mark just as we did with the stock drive. The first configuration is our 4 terabyte SSD right out of the box without any heat dissipation hardware. The second configuration is the same SSD with a graphene heat dissipation sticker installed. The third configuration is the same SSD with a low-profile aluminum and copper alloy heatsink installed. And the fourth and final configuration is that same 4 terabyte SSD with a low-profile copper bracket-style heatsink tightly wrapping our SSD. It's important to note that for both of the heatsinks here, the optional step of removing the plastic peg from the back of the case has to be performed first. Let's take a look at the thermal performance data we collected as part of our benchmark. Looking at our columns from left to right, we have current, minimum, maximum, and average temperatures by the end of the benchmark. But immediately, you will notice that we have 3 rows of sensors instead of the 2 we saw with the stock SSD. And in general, most drives I've tested in other projects have this third sensor, which is the temperature of the SSD's ASIC controller. You can think of an ASIC controller as a primitive CPU-like device that lives in the SSD, and it's used to execute instructions on chunks of SSD data. For both the no heat dissipation and graphene heat sticker configuration, the ASIC controller is getting way too hot, and this is due to the location of the NVMe SSD hanging right above the Ally's CPU and GPU heatsink. By the time we get to the copper alloy heatsink, the temperatures are much more manageable. And for the copper bracket heatsink, our NAND hotspot temperatures completely stomp the Ally's stock drive thermal performance. It's too bad the stock drive doesn't report the ASIC controller's temperature, but it's not uncommon that the ASIC runs a good deal hotter than the NAND temperatures. Now let's compare our thermals and performance of our best performing configuration of the 4 terabyte NVMe SSD against the stock drive that was included with our Ally. Wow, look at that! Not only do we have better thermal characteristics, but we have faster benchmarks across the board. Also, we've seen even better performance with other drive configurations that we don't cover under the scope of this video. For example, we had a drive that hit nearly 7 gigs per second, and that was on the read test. If we have a great deal of interest here, we can go over more SSDs later, but our goal here was to provide a set of devices with reasonable cost versus performance expectations. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss out on all the amazing tips, tricks, mods, and toy shenanigans we've got coming down the pipeline.